Respected Chancellor Dr. A.K. Pansari, Professor Y.S. Murthy, Vice Chancellor, Royal Global University, Registrar Dr. D.N. Singh, Professor Krishna Purva, Dean, Royal School of Languages, Professor Sheila Bora, Professor Emeritus in the Department of History, my esteemed colleagues in the Royal School of Languages, and also members of faculty from different departments. Sri Satyaranjan Bora, one of the acclaimed spiritual activists, and also the President, Kutumba Surakha Parishad, Dr. Sanjeev Kumar Nath, my dear friend from Guwahati University, and also other distinguished guests, my dear students, research scholars, and also the Royal Global University fraternity. আপোনালোক সকলোকে সশ্ৰদ্ধা সম্ভাষণ আৰু নমস্কাৰ জনাইছোঁ। যিগৰাকী স্বয়মহিম্নী মহাপুৰুষৰ ইতিহাস উজ্জ্বল স্মৃতিৰ ছাঁত আমি সকলোতো সমবেত হৈছোঁ, যাৰ উজ্জ্বল আৰু বিশালায়তন অৱদানে আৰু স্মৃতিৰ প্ৰবাহত আমি প্ৰোজ্জ্বল আৰু পুণ্যস্নাত হৈছোঁ। সেইগৰাকী অলোকসামান্য ঐতিহাসিক পুৰুষ, ভাৰতীয় সংস্কৃতিৰ উদ্গাতা শ্ৰীমন্ত শংকৰদেৱৰ পুণ্যশ্লোক সত্তালৈ শিৰ দোৱাইছোঁ। I congratulate Royal Global University and the Royal School of Languages in particular for mounting this noble initiative and also their flagship program by instituting the annual Srimanta Sankardeva lecture series in the hallowed memory of one of the most illustrious minds of medieval India, hailing from Assam, Srimanta Sankardeva, saint and preacher, poet and playwright, philosopher and reformer, artist and composer, all rolled into one. I feel greatly honored and humbled to have been asked to stand before this august assembly and speak first in this series. While I express my profound gratitude to my dear colleagues in the department, Professor Krishna Borwa in particular, for doing me this honor, I stand with great humility and a sense of diffidence with my limitations to do justice to the honor and responsibility vested on me. To begin with, I wonder, like the Greek tragedian Euripides' Electra, pronouncing more than 2 millennia ago, how should I begin? How should I end? What should go in the middle? Because the life and personality, thoughts and works of myriad nature and form, not to speak of his exemplary life and works other than literature, their abiding impact on immediate generations after him, as well as the ages of cultural history of Assam and neighboring areas till the time we stand here, constitute so massive a wave of semiotic science with meanings that it is exasperatingly difficult to reckon with them. I feel impelled to refer to a much quoted quote of Dr. Vasudev Agarwal, the great Indologist. And I quote, Shankardeva was like the glorious sun under whose warmth of mind Assam blossomed like a lotus of 1,000 petals, Sahasradala Kamala. It is difficult to imagine how deep and widespread was the influence of Shankardeva on the cultural renaissance that burst forth in Assam, in medieval Assam. There are poets and composers, there are saints and religious teachers, there are musical masters, There are preachers, but Shankardeva was a genius in which all these qualities rolled into one, unquote. Such gratifying encomiums came from many of the great minds of our time as well, ranging from Dr. Radhakrishnan, the former President of India and also the great philosopher, Nilkanta Singh, Nilkanta Shastri, the great Vedic Vidwan, Sunita Kumar Chatterjee, the polymath, K.M. Panikkar, the eminent historian, who observed that Shankardeva took Assam to India and brought India to Assam, and several others. It comes to my mind of Dr. Kapila Vatsyayan, the doyen of Indian art, in her inaugural address of Shankardeva's 550th anniversary of birth, held in Calcutta decades back, said that the Mahapurusha churned and churned the ocean of wisdom of India and left the Amrita for the whole of the country. Equally go to even a longer list of literary and cultural stalwarts from Assam, like Lakshminath Bezborua, Jyoti Prasad Agarwala, Vishnu Prasad Rabha, Dr. Mahesh Shonau, Dr. Bhupen Hazarika, to name a few. This makes the task of assessing and accounting Shankardeva and his manifold contributions more difficult, as no work of his creative oeuvre stands or can be studied in isolation. Each work or text is interwoven with multiple texts and contexts, which reminds us of the Vishnu Dharmottara Purana, the great treatise on Indian aesthetics, envisaging the interrelationship of all Indian arts, poetry, drama, music, dance, painting, sculpture, each of them penetrating into other. Let me, for a moment, have a quick look at the historical backdrop of the expansive scenario of the medieval Bhakti movement in India, the gentle stream of which was led by Shankardeva 1449-1569 in the Brahmaputra Valley. India and Europe almost contemporaneously saw an upsurge of humanism, finding expression through Reformation movements. However, in this similar context during 14th, 16th centuries, as the Renaissance and the Reformation in Europe created a watershed of far-reaching social, cultural, and political implications, and brought forth a phenomenal creative fervor at different levels in Europe, breeding the Indian scenario in which the reformist zeal, breeding in deep humanistic fervency, found expression with new schools of thought and blossoming of new genres of art and literature. While the Alvars, the group of bardic singers of the deep south in the 7th, 8th centuries who sang of man and divinity in subversion of the established religious, social, and institutional authorities, were the precursors of this new move. This humanistic reformist zeal, posterior to the Acharyas of the south, traveled a long way through the Deccan and the Gangetic Valley to the east and up to the farthest northeast corner of the idyllic Bharatabarsha. I call idyllic because Bharatbarsha at the time and before that and even after that was never a political entity as such ruled by a single emperor or a king. But there was the concept of Bharatbarsha going on since the ancient civilizational years down to the coming of the British. Idyllic Bharatavarsha, showing the seeds of a new look at the relationship between man and the divinity, with a humane approach towards the path of pursuit of the supreme truth in God. The journey of what we often call as bhakti, intense, unflinching, sensuous love and devotion to God, sa bhakti parama prema rupa. Contextualizing diverse social, religious, cultural, and philosophical concerns and situations in itself constitutes a huge discourse, as it connects multiplicity of voices, saintly and poetic, in multiplicity of languages across the subcontinent, set in a multicultural matrix. The journey in its course enlivened and empowered the social and individual mind in each of the areas through which it flowed, and in the process led to an unprecedented treasure of literary and other cultural productions for the sea of humanity. Notwithstanding the fact that the Bhakti movement springing up in various regions of medieval India was rooted with a chord of unison, with emotionalism of bhakti embedded in the loving relationship between the devotee and the deity, being the spirit of the age. It can be likened with the zeitgeist coined by the famous cultural historian of 19th century, Jacob Burckhardt, in explaining the Renaissance in Italy. Its expressions and ramifications in the Indian context again, ramifications in each geographical location, language, and society were diverse and distinctive of their own. I shall try to look at Shankardeva's creative works from the praxis of the spirit of the age that I have just mentioned, and in the light of cultural history of Assam. As biographical narratives, we have abundant number of biographical narratives which were created or written both in the raw oral and written tradition in the wake of the Bhakti movement in Assam after the passing away of Shankardeva. As biographical narratives indicate, Shankardeva was born to a family of chieftains of the Barabhuya principality in the present Nagaon district, and the family was adept in scholarly pursuits and fine arts, if not literary activities, which acted as an inspiration in his initiation to learning in Mahendra Kandoli's Pathsala. There he received the academic orientation and philosophical foundation of various disciplines of Sanskrit learning, what we call today at the academic parlor the Indian knowledge system. Returning home after years of institutional learning, the meditative young scholar and the poet in him penned the Harishchandra Upakhyan, his maiden creative work. Of course, during his initial days in the Pathsala, he penned a particular work which Sania has just recited, just using the consonants, Karatala Kamala Kamala Dala Nayana, Bhavadava Dahana Gahana Bana Hayana, Napara Napara Para Hatarata Gamaya, Habhaya Abhaya Bhaya Mamahara Hatata. Just an invocation to Lord Vishnu, without using any of the vowels. Simply learning the consonants, he penned this particular poem that showed the prodigious future of the great saint to be in Shankardeva. Maiden creative work, taking the brief storyline from the Markandeya Purana, but expounding it his own imagination, but expounding with his own imagination to make it an expression of bhakti as well as a social commentary on atrocities of the Brahminic order. Relenting to pressures of the family sinews, he had to shoulder the chieftainship of the Barabhuya principality as the Shiromani Bhuya, as it was so called at that time, which at another level facilitated his understanding of social realities, the plight of the underprivileged, created by Varnashrama, intriguing social tension coming of internecine political and ethnic feuds, among various communities around. Amidst the series of welfare measures that he undertook as the Bhuya Lord was also a philosophical approach towards ameliorating social inequalities and tensions, doing away with obscurantist and superstitious practices, causing much of the social malaise, and creating a chord of harmony among all through spiritual enlightenment, underlying in the concept of bhakti and its pursuit. Towards this goal, he set up a Harigriha, now it has been transformed into the popular nomenclature of Namghar all across the Brahmaputra Valley. Towards this goal, he set up a Harigriha. The name is indicated by the biographical narratives. In the domestic premises, started discourses on the idiom and merits of bhakti that sent a new message of love all across and found a large following. In deference to the desire of the attendees of his orations, Shankardeva, with prodigious imagination and organizing prowess, mounted the first lyrico-dramatic spectacle, Sina Jatra, with pictorial representation of the heavens, with paintings on paper pulp called as tulapat. Paper pulp, interweaving with this exercise was music composed by him, set to innovative melodic and rhythmic verse modes, dances that he composed, dramatic accessories like masks, etc., a plethora of community activities which went into it. That consummated to a spectacular performance under his leadership and direction, which also went to familiarize the people or popular mind with unfamiliar metaphors from mythical history of India. The Sina Jatra left a deep imprint on the social mind and an enduring impact on the whole of tradition of fine arts that flowered during the entire period of Bhakti movement in Assam. It also laid the ethos of participatoriness and interactive flow at all levels of society, including that of literary creativity during the period after him. The long pilgrimage of 12 years that he undertook at the early age of 32 years, visiting many of the holy shrines, including the Sri Kshetra of Puri, the Jagannath Kshetra, many holy shrines of the country, and the Bhagavata Purana crystallized his vision in teaching, in trading a holistic path with his mission of bhakti. It further sharpened his intellect and creative mind to engage himself in the creative pursuits, relentlessly braving all obstacles and unfriendly circumstances till the end of his life that came in 1569. Shankardeva, a gifted and prodigious composer that he was, however, took to pen not simply for vindication of his inner creative yearning. Behind each of his works, be it poetry, drama, cluster of the devotional hymns or doxology, renderings from the Bhagavata, the treatises on bhakti, the theatrical device he laid, painting and sculpture, and relief in woven textiles that he designed, each of which came to be a marvel, a trendsetter, was underlying a social purpose and a deeper social commitment, and a futuristic vision as well, towards enlightenment of the surrounding society and man as an individual being. Being a classicist and perfectionist composer, he did not waver from the inner merit, virtuosity of art, and was conscious that it did not get overshadowed by his doctrinal mission. is extensive over comprising two epic narratives, Harishchandra Upakhana and Rukmini Harana, two other such smaller narratives, Kurukshetra and Bolisalana, 6 full-length plays, in addition to the earlier experimental work, Sinhajatra, renderings of 8 books, skandhas, of the Bhagavata Purana, a cluster of more than 200 devotional hymns set to a series of melodic and rhythmic modes, the monumental Kirtana, considered to be the piece de resistance of Shankardeva's works, 2 treatises on Bhakti, Bhakti Pradip in Assamese verse, and the Bhakti Ratnakara, an anthology of philosophical precepts on Bhakti, culled from a variety of sources, systematically organized in 38 chapters, with his own commentaries in Sanskrit, have been works of wonder, coming from the same author in almost all prevailing forms of the time. He wrote all these even in the face of his unsettling life, because practically for the whole of life, he had to travel, he had to move from one place to another in the face of hostile or unfriendly circumstances. And at the same time, he had also a series of family bereavements. I do not propose a critical appraisal of his volume of works, but intend to place before you a few perspectives that perspire through the schemata of his corpus. Coming from a Shaivite family, prior to him, his father and also his forefathers were all Shaiva worshippers. But from the Shaiva family, he had become a Vaishnavite. Coming from a Shaivite family, he was drawn towards the emotionalism of Bhakti around Lord Krishna, celebrated as the human manifestation of the Vedantic Brahman, Purushottama, Mahapurusha in the mellifluous poetry of the Bhagavata Purana. Krishnastu Bhagavan Swayam Samastakhila Sarabhutaha. This emotional strain of bhakti in the form of unflinching and unmotivated love, with complete surrender to the grace and blissfulness of Lord Krishna as friend, savior, and the most adorable persona, is deeply embedded in all his works. As a poet, although he wrote most of the works in the Bhasha tradition, the vernacular language, Assamese as a name, as a nomenclature of the language that we speak today, was yet to emerge during the time of Shankardeva. All across the country, other than Sanskrit, it was called as the Bhasha tradition of all the regional languages. He was, however, deeply immersed in the hallowed tradition of Indian poetics, or aesthetics for that matter, from which he drew and redrew. Indian poetics and its rich trajectory perhaps dawned well on his genius as a poet and his triangular mindset. Bhakti-inspired, committed social thinker, and a sensitive poet, as said in the Agni Purana, Apare Kaiva Sangsare Kabire Evo Prajapatihi. Prajapatihi, in the world of poetry, the poet is the creator, like the Prajapati Brahma of the Indian Trinity. Shankardeva, like that creator, like that Prajapati, Shankardeva, in that sense of being a creator, went on creating and recreating for the blissful joy of the masses and for their enlightenment. Even though Bhakti was the ideal behind, he drew that ideal down to the realities of life and the art. Poetry in India, since time immemorial, is called as Ahlada Laukikam, giver of joy through the supernatural. Several of Indian treatises on poetics, like the Vishnu Purana and Bhamaha's Kavyalankara. Poetry is hailed as Sabda Murtidhara. It's an image in itself. Each word is an image in itself in poetry. Dharma kama muksheshu vishabhaishakshanam kalasucha. And it combines the four ways of life, dharma, artha, kama, and moksha, in spite of being expressive form of an art. Or in other words, a divine dispensation. Such a perception of literature and other arts was abidingly visible in Indian writers, music composers, and even the cognoscenti of arts till the time of the British. Medieval Indian theatre that emerged in the wake of the Sanskrit theatre, medieval Indian theatre that emerged on the wane of Sanskrit theatre, including that of Shankardeva's drama and theatre, behind which the resurgence of Bhakti was the motivational force, exuded the same divine flavor in different proportions. Shankardeva, in all his works as a master strategist and a deft communicator, brought a balance between the sacred and the profane, Adhyatmika and Laukika. Beginning from his Harishchandra Upakhana to Rama Vijayanath being his swan song, he adopts a twofold strategy, elevating the narrative or the play to the height and grandeur of classical spirituality and infusing into them elements drawn from the mundane, many a time in violation of established precepts and canons, more particularly in the theatrical mode of the plays. He traversed his own path in visualization of the play themes and their performance representations. I would like to place before you two simple examples to this effect. The Natya Shastra, all we know, the Natya Shastra being the first ever work on Indian aesthetics. The Natya Shastra prescribes a session of the preliminaries before the actual beginning of a theatrical presentation called as Purvaranga. The treatise is, however, not specific as to what exactly a preliminary constituted of. Taking a cue of the conceptual frame of reference of the preliminaries Purvaranga, Shankardeva, beginning from his Sinhajatra that I just mentioned, Sinhajatra imaginatively devised it as a spectacular orchestral performance, orchestral ensemble, replete with dance movements. The session, on the other hand, brings the abstract to the concrete through a subtle adaptation of the classical ranga to the nuanced local of Dhamali, but distinctive of its own at the same time. Likewise, the Sutradhara of Sanskrit theatre has found itself a complete new form of immense significance in Shankardeva's play tradition. While in Sanskrit theatre, the Sutradhara appears on the scene and introduces the theme of the play and disappears. The same Sutradhara, in his new attire and role in a Shankardeva play, is invested with a greater role, marking a departure from the Sanskrit dramaturgy. After initial invocation to the Lord, as it is a sacred ritual too, sacred performance too, the Sutradhara, being a master in singing and dance, introduces the theme of the play through song and dance to the audience sitting around the performance space, and takes to himself the role of the director of the play getting performed. It is through his indications the character personages enter, get into work, and get into action and move out. While sometime the Sutradhara can be likened to the chorus of the Greek tragedy tradition, pronouncing commentaries on events on and outside, on and behind the stage. At some other time, he mediates between the actors and the spectators sitting around, considering them as a particular partaker of the entire event, particular partaker of the entire performance. Unlike in respect of a Shakespeare's play or Shakespearean play, what the poet and critic Coleridge described the audience to be in a state of willing suspension of disbelief, the Sutradhara brings the audience to the state of reality from the world of myth, what Bertolt Brecht caused alienation in his epic theatre. In all these respects, Shankardeva got away from the prevailing form and style of classical Sanskrit theatre and created a distinctive space and style of his own, not to be found in other forms of medieval Indian theatre like Kathakali, Yakshagana, Kuchipudi, and Yatra. Setting aside the Natyasastra concept of an illustrative Rangagriha, Shankardeva transposed theatre within the simplistic architectural space of the Namghar by converting it to a theatrical space with no scenography at all. Whatever required is done at the virtual level with narratives of the Sutradhara, taking the audience into trust and confidence. Introduction of prose into the plays of Shankardeva. Introduction of prose in his plays was another milestone of Shankardeva in the realm of entire range of medieval Indian drama and theatre. He played an experimental role by using the Brajabhasha, or popularly called in Assam as Brajavali, the prevailing poetic language of Bhakti poets in eastern India, by mixing local vocabularies with Maithili and Hindi to some extent. He developed a newer stylized idiom of expression in both his plays and devotional hymns, the Borgits, known as Borgits. Prose and poetry replete with lyrico-musical grandeur, and dance sequences elevated Shankardeva's plays, Ankiyanat as we call today, to an unparalleled work of artistry and a medium of joy and bliss for the spectators. Their state and social visionary in Shankardeva was in unison in devising Ankiyanat that also opened up the passage of socialization of arts. Like his democratization of the Bhakti faith, against the backdrop of royal and political patronage that never came to his life in any part of his life. Of course, towards the last decade of his life, some amount of peace came to his life with some amount of help coming from the court's kingdom. So, against the backdrop of royal and political patronage, one of the key factors in the world of Indian art, beginning from ancient time to the medieval age, all artistic expressions, the Ankiyanat and the Bhavana in particular, were exceptions bereft of any such patronage. The Ankiya Bhavana, since the time of Shankardeva, is enduring as a play of the people, by the people, and for the people, to borrow the words of Abraham Lincoln. In this context, I am reminded of a famous quote of one of the greatest scholars of Indian drama, late Professor Dasarath Oza of Delhi University. He once told, I quote from him, "The credit of writing an entire play in Deshi Bhasha goes to Mahapurusha Shankardeva of Assam. Although prior to him, a kind of play was composed and staged in Avahatta in the form of ras. No play in prose, in poetry, is to be found till we come to Shankardeva. Bearing the great tradition of Sanskrit theatre, it was for the first time that Shankardeva used prose as a medium of drama and theatre. It also reminds me of another kind of, another statement by Kapila Bhatt, the great critic and scholar of Indian art. She said once that Shankardeva's plays do not get subsumed to the performance. Once it is done, but the text, the chiseled, aesthetic qualities of text as a written one stands as it is. All these novelties and ingenuities ingrained in Shankardeva's conceptualization of drama and theatre perhaps led Girish Karnad, the great thespian and playwright of our time, to hail Shankardeva as the harbinger of modern Indian theatre. Shankardeva Chinadatra unfurled a great performance tradition of manifold forms, music, dance, and theatre in particular, interwoven with each other, constituting a composite matrix. The spectacular success of his noble exercise endowed his vision in exploring the tremendous possibilities of arts, the performing ones in particular, for augmenting his mission of bhakti among the masses. Before his eyes were great mass of people, mostly unlettered, in the absence of a social literacy system. The Brahminical patsalas were restricted to the elites and upper castes, with no space for the commoners, not to speak of the exterior castes or tribes, with a view to sensitizing the people at large towards the ideal of bhakti and bringing some form of letterment. He evolved Sravana and Kirtana, listening and singing to the praise of God, as the medium of singular importance in the pursuit of bhakti, and also placed all his works for singing in congregations in the sacred space of Namghar. Each of his compositions, the Kirtana, Ghosha, the hymns, the Bhagavata renderings, the epic narratives, including the Ramayana of Madhava Kandali translation, was sung or recited in the congregational sessions, which found reinforcement with the entry of Madhavdeva, 1486-1596, his dearest disciple, the brightest in the apostolate order, and a great poet, composer himself, endowed with a silver tongue. The large public assemblies constituted of people across communities with a newfound experience were empowered with a kind of learning without alphabets. It also paved the way for the growth of Namghars in rural areas as centers of non-formal education. Through such art experiences, this is what amounts to illiterate literacy as described by the great historian Dr. Surya Kumar Bhuya, coming of the performance traditions. This was also the mode through which Shankardeva brought the wider populace nearer to the understanding and appreciation of the literary humaniores of India. To this effect, the most significant and concurrent synergy came from the language that Shankardeva adopted for most of his compositions. It has been said earlier that despite his profound erudition in Sanskrit, being the Devabhasa, for all matters related to religion, philosophy, and all forms of higher education or higher learning, he chose to write in the language used and spoken by man, and thus placed the epic and Puranic literature at the doorstep of the commoners. Since all forms of writings were wrought on manuscripts or Thulapat or Ogurubaks through a prolonged process and laborsome process in preparing such manuscript leaves in the absence of printing for conveniencing multiple copies. Oral written continuum was the only mode for transmission and dissemination of knowledge of texts. By adopting Sravana and Kirtana is in concourse of people, Shankardeva achieved remarkable success to this effect. Writing in the Bhasha or vernacular tradition instead of distant Sanskrit, unintelligible for the commoners, brings to our mind several other dynamics of historical importance. Through his works and that of Madhavadeva and their adoration by the wider public mind, Assamese language found itself elevated as the language of the sacred, without, however, demeaning Sanskrit. All religious transactions, including placement of a sacred text at the sanctum sanctorum, have taken place with works left by them. It is worthwhile to remember that in a gradual move, let me go to the European context for a moment, in a gradual move towards establishment of English as a national language, more particularly during the Renaissance and Reformation, it was through Queen Elizabeth's proclamation of the Articles of Religion when, during the Tudor dynasty, English found its entrenchment as a language of the church, but not before. Always it was Latin as a classical language. I quote from the Articles of Faith, Articles of Religion 24. Within quote, it is a thing repugnant to the word of God and a custom of the primitive church that services should be conducted in a tongue not understood of the people, unquote. While English found its placement as the language of the church in England in the 16th century, even prior to that, Shankardeva elevated Assamese as the language of the sacred. 16th century, in a distant corner in India, it was through the vision of the great saint and spontaneous participation of the common people that the language of the people came to be elevated as the language of the sacred. It also reminds me of another interesting sequence in this context. Even after establishment of English as a national language, with its great literary treasure, beginning from Chaucer down to the time of John Milton. Milton, in spite of his great patriotism, deeper commitment to the Protestant religion, deeper commitment to his language and a nation, Paradise Lost, language and people, while writing his monumental Paradise Lost, aiming at glorification of his native land, had to infuse into it Hebraic Latin to qualify his work, unattempted yet in prose or rhyme, quoting from Milton himself. More than 100 years before the age of Milton, Shankardeva, sitting in a corner of the Brahmaputra Valley with his erudition in Sanskrit, demonstrated his profound faith and expressiveness of the language of the people to bear the religio-philosophical inventories of the millennium-old temple language, that is Sanskrit. It was like an unlabored clean sweep for him to transform the heavily loaded Sanskrit canonical texts to simple and racy language of the soil, always marked by what William Wordsworth, the high priest of Romanticism in England, said of his poetic diction as, within quote, with certain coloring of imagination and resonance of music. Shankardeva's massive literary productions in racy yet melodic verse in bhasha, and his vision behind can also be looked upon from the praxis of literary history. It is often said that formulation of the genius of the nations finds its unmistakably individual expression in its language and literature. It is more than a common feature in all regions of multilingual India. Language and literature many a time led to giving rise of what the famous 18th century German thinker Johann Gottfried Herder called as a specific brand of cultural nationalism. In a similar tone, the Victorian thinker Thomas Carlyle, writing in 1831, said, I quote, "The history of a nation's poetry, the history of a nation's poetry is the essence of its history, political, scientific, and religious," unquote. In accordance to this, René Wellek, the famous 20th century critic and scholar, observed, I quote again from Wellek, literature is the expression of a nation's spirit and in some vague way, the creation of a national mind. Coming to Shankardeva's literary works and his inner vision behind his writings, we find that he did not invoke Assam or Kamarupa as such, nor any trace of nationalistic zeal as such in any place of his work, except eulogizing his birthplace, Bordeaux, in several occasions. But he sang soulfully of the glory of Bharatavarsha on many occasions as a sacred land. But carrying the legacy of the genius of the language, that is the language of the people. But carrying the legacy of the genius of the language and people of his own land, finding expression in the oral tradition, the Charyapadas, and the epic streams of the group of his preceding generation of poets, including Madhav Kandali in particular, Shankardeva set and reset the entire range of mythical material in the social and cultural ecology of the land and its people, be it in his magnum opus, the Kirtana, or the Bhagavata renderings with particular reference to the Rasa Panchadhyaya of the book 10, Dasamaskandha. We find revealing expression of the flora and fauna, the ways of life and social setup belonging to that of the valley, as if the entire Vrindavana, the Yamuna, the trees and creepers around them are pulsating with the flavors and melodies of the nature of Assam, replete with metaphors and images drawn from their surrounding lives. Thus, he strengthened and reinforced the genius of the language and the mind of its speakers and the hereditament which he received from the past and its use in the future. The treasure of literature and art, both as an art and as a device, needs no reiteration, more particularly in a seat of higher education like that of us. It is the art of translation that led to the building of bridges across cultures. It has also been a door through which ancient epics and other literary treasures traveled to distant humanities. Translation has also found itself elevated to a distinct discipline of study and research since the last century, pouring into its web of interpretations coming from diverse ends, including those of Cicero, Horace, and Quintilian of the pre-Christian era. The history of translation is also at times beset with bitter debates, cruelty, and violence, as happened in respect of the translation of the Bible by John Wycliffe and William Tyndale in the 15th and 16th centuries, 14th and 15th centuries, who were put to brutal death, punishing them of the act of sorcery in translating the sacred text by the order of the church. Against such backdrops, the epics and Puranic texts in the Indian scenario found a free passage all across the country in the form of multitude of translations and adaptations in the Bhasha tradition. A fluorescence of regional literatures in medieval India, ranging from the Tamil land in the deep south to the farthest Assam and Manipur, can be ascribed to the spark in translation. In such a buoyant environment, Shankardeva handled the art of translation with mastery and dexterity. It was the same vision of reaching to the masses and letterment of the unlettered that he took to translating 8 books of the Bhagavata himself. But in his handling of the Bhagavata in Assamese verse, we always perceive an authorial voice with precision, omission, and elaboration of the original, depending on suitability and effectiveness to the local environment. Instead of effecting a verbatim or word-to-word translation, he did a sense per sense, sense for sense translation, what Horace centuries ago described as sed sensum exprima di sensu. And to a great extent, he performs the task of cultural translation, much acclaimed in the modern academic disciplines of translation studies. On many occasions, he is more interpretative, like a modern hermeneutic. To cite an example in this regard, drawing upon a few verses of the book 3, just a few verses of the book 3, he develops an independent chapter or section in the book 3 relating to the origin or creation of the universe. Shankardeva develops an independent section complete in itself on the beginninglessness of the cosmos, named Anadipatana, with his own interpretation, where he sings of man and human body also. I shall be failing my duty in the discussion of Shankardeva's art of translation without a reference to his rendering of the Uttarakanda book of Valmiki's Ramayana, where he supplemented to his predecessor, Madhava Kandali's apparently incomplete work. In this segment, we come across an interpretive voice of the translator. As Sita was brought back from Valmiki's hermitage during Rama's Ashwamedha sacrifice for adornment of the seat of the queen, she is no more the gentle and loving lady dedicated to her husband. She instead registers her vehement protest against the injustice meted out to her. She deplores her banishment, causing untold miseries and distress and agony that Rama wrought on her for the sake of saving himself of public ignominy and upholding his own image as an ideal king, raising a series of questions of propriety and justice on his irrational judgment, including that of putting her to the fire test Agni Pariksha. In Ravana's Lanka, she vowed not to see his face, and let alone accepting the throne, the honor of sitting on the throne as the queen of Ayodhya. Thereafter, as in the original, she invoked the mother art to take her to her womb and disappeared in retribution. Such a vociferous remonstration given to the voice of Sita, not found in Valmiki's Ramayana, is also an uncommon stance in other language versions of the epic. This might have come of the poet's deep sense of empathy towards the plight of Sita and her sufferings thrust on her by the willful act of Rama, even in her state of pregnancy. I would like to conclude with a much discussed point referring to Shankardeva's singing in glory of Bharatavarsha. I mentioned a few moments back. Bharatavarsha as a part of his literary vision and that of his saintly journey. Not once, but on many more than 50 occasions, he invoked Bharata, not as a political entity, but as a land of wisdom, a sacred land. It must be the unfathomable cultural richness and multilinear streams of wisdom that he encountered and experienced in the course of his first pilgrimage. He took a second pilgrimage at the age of 91. That must have left deep imprint on his consciousness to address the Punya Bhumi recurrently, at times advisorily, at some other time as statements, and on other occasions as invocations. Besides these occasional references, Shankardeva designated a chapter in his Sanskrit treatise I mentioned earlier, Bhakti Ratnakara, titled as Bharata Bhu Prasamsa, chapter 33, in which he called 10 verses from various sources, supplemented with his own commentary to this effect. Nowhere in medieval bhakti literature or in saints and composers we come across such eulogium of Bharata and celebration of human life to be born in it. To conclude, I would like to refer the great 12th century Indian aesthetician Anandavardhana, who describing Kalidasa called him as Aloka Samanya Pratibha Vishesham. Aloka Samanya Pratibha Vishesham. Perhaps if Anandavardhana belonged to the age of Shankardeva, he would also have described Shankardeva taking the entire range of his vision, his works, and also his, proliferous kind of, contributions. Anandavardhana would have described, eulogized Shankardeva as the Aloka Samanya Pratibha Vishesham. Respected members of the audience, I am afraid you must have been tired with my drudgery of words and mumblings. My words are few to express my deep sense of gratitude to all of you for your kind and patient hearing. Once again, I place on record my deep sense of beholdenness to the University Fraternity, to the Honorable Chancellor, who is kindly sitting all over the time, University Fraternity and the Department of English for granting me this honor. Namaskar. Thank you.